From the outside, they looked like the perfect couple. A beautiful home, a loving marriage, a life people envied. But sometimes perfection is just a carefully crafted lie.
He never raised his voice, never left a mark. But slowly, quietly, he began to take control. Not of her life, but of her reality. When you start questioning your own memories, when truth feels uncertain, you begin to wonder, are you being manipulated, or are you losing your mind?
But every story has a breaking point. One night, one argument, one moment where everything spiraled out of control.
A man disappears, a wife remains calm, and a truth begins to surface, darker than anyone imagined. Because sometimes the real horror isn't the crime, it's what led to it.
The house had never been this quiet before. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence that wrapped around you like comfort. This silence felt heavy, unnatural. It pressed against the walls, lingered in the corners, and settled deep into Ayla's chest as she stood in the middle of the living room, completely still. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. The cushions on the sofa were aligned, as if untouched. The glass table reflected the ceiling light without a single smudge. Even the curtains hung neatly, unmoving, as though the outside world had stopped existing. Anyone walking in would think this was a home where nothing had ever gone wrong. Ayla slowly exhaled, her fingers tightening around the phone in her hand. No new messages, no missed calls. She had checked at least 20 times in the past hour. Her thumb hovered over her husband's name, Zayan, but she didn't press it. She couldn't. The thought of hearing his ringtone echo somewhere it shouldn't be made her stomach twist. Or worse, not hearing it at all. She placed the phone down carefully, almost gently, as if any sudden movement might break the fragile illusion she had built around herself. "Everything is fine," she whispered, though her voice sounded unfamiliar, distant. Her eyes drifted toward the kitchen. That's where it started. Or, that's where it ended. She wasn't sure anymore. A single glass lay near the sink, cracked down the side. She had cleaned the floor twice, scrubbing until her hands ached, but she could still remember the sound it made when it shattered. Sharp, sudden, final. Her breathing became uneven. "No," she muttered, shaking her head slightly, as if trying to push the memory away. It wasn't like that. She stepped back into the living room, her movements slow, controlled. Every step felt calculated, like she was rehearsing something, like someone might be watching. But no one was there. That was the problem. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. Time felt distorted inside this house, like it had lost its meaning the moment Ayla stopped. Her gaze shifted downward. There, that spot. It was faint now, almost invisible. Anyone else would miss it completely, but she couldn't. She knew exactly where to look. A slight discoloration on the floor, a shadow that refused to disappear. Her chest tightened as she stared at it, her mind replaying fragments she couldn't fully piece together. Raised voices, accusations, the look in his eyes, something she had never seen before. Or maybe she had. Maybe she had just refused to see it. Her knees felt weak, but she didn't move. She couldn't look away. Her voice trembled, barely audible. The silence around her seemed to lean closer, listening. Her lips parted again, and this time the words slipped out, fragile and broken. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." The house remained still, unforgiving, and somewhere deep within that silence, the truth waited. Unspoken. What if the perfect marriage you admire is hiding something so dark it could destroy everything you believe about love? A husband disappears without a trace, but the real question is, why didn't his wife report it right away? He didn't shout. He didn't hit. So how did he slowly break her mind without anyone noticing? When you start questioning your own memory, your own reality, how do you know what's real and what someone wants you to believe? A hidden file, an unknown woman, a case that was never closed. What if this wasn't the first time something went terribly wrong? One night, one argument, one moment that changed everything. But was it self-defense or something much darker? The evidence didn't scream guilt, but the silence inside that house told a different story. The silence didn't start in one night. It had been growing for years, hidden beneath smiles, filtered photos, and carefully chosen words. Before the quiet, there was laughter. Ayla could still remember the beginning, how effortless everything felt. Zayan had a way of making people feel seen, like they mattered more in his presence. The first time he spoke to her, his voice was calm, confident, almost magnetic. "You overthink too much," he had said with a soft smile. "Let me handle things." At the time, it felt comforting, safe. Their life quickly became something others admired. Pictures of dinners, vacations, soft candlelight evenings. Every moment looked like a scene pulled from perfection. Friends would comment, "You two are made for each other." Strangers would double tap, leaving hearts under carefully curated happiness. And Ayla, she believed it too, at least in the beginning. "You trust me, right?" Zayan's voice echoed in her memory, smooth but firm. "Of course I do," she had replied instantly. He smiled then, but there was something in his eyes, something unreadable. Good. Because trust is everything. Without it, relationships fall apart. It sounded like love. It sounded like wisdom. But over time, it began to feel like something else. Small things changed first. He would correct her stories in front of others, laughing it off as a joke. "That's not how it happened, Ayla. You always mix things up." She would laugh too, even when she was sure she was right. Then came the questions. "Why didn't you tell me you were going out?" "I did," she would say, confused. "No, you didn't," he would reply calmly. "You're forgetting again." Again. That word lingered. It made her doubt herself, just enough to let it go. Ayla tried harder after that. She paid attention to every detail, every conversation, every moment, just to avoid being wrong, just to avoid that look Zayan gave her when she slipped. Disappointed, controlled. "Relax," he would say, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'm just trying to help you. You get overwhelmed easily." Help. That's what he called it. One evening, the illusion cracked, just for a moment. They were sitting across from each other at dinner, the soft glow of candlelight flickering between them. It looked perfect, just like all the photos. But something felt off. "Who were you texting earlier?" Zayan asked casually, cutting his food with precision. Ayla looked up, surprised. "Just Sarah." He didn't look convinced. "You smiled at your phone." "I can't smile now," she said lightly, trying to keep the tone playful. His fork paused midair. Slowly, he placed it down. "I didn't say that," he replied, his voice quieter now. "Why are you getting defensive?" "I'm not," she said quickly. "I was just—" "You always do this," he interrupted, leaning back. "Turn things around. Make it seem like I'm the problem." Ayla blinked, her chest tightening. "I didn't mean—" "I'm just asking a simple question," he continued, his tone calm again, almost gentle. "But you react like this. It's exhausting." The words hit harder than they should have. She looked down at her plate, her appetite gone. "I'm sorry," she said softly. The tension dissolved instantly. Zayan smiled again, reaching across the table to hold her hand. "See? That wasn't so hard." And just like that, everything looked perfect again. And slowly, Ayla stopped arguing back. Not because she agreed. What if things were being changed? Days turned into weeks. And slowly, something unsettling began to form. The same conversations repeated, but slightly altered. Not angry. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't the first time. The realization didn't fade with sleep. It sharpened. All day, Ayla moved through the house with a quiet awareness. Every sound amplified. Every glance from Zayan dissected in her mind. She watched him more carefully now. His tone, his pauses, the way he chose his words. He noticed. Of course he did. "You're quiet today," Zayan said that evening, loosening his watch as he stepped into the living room. "Just tired," Ayla replied, her voice steady. He studied her for a moment, then smiled. "You think too much when you're tired." The words felt familiar. Too familiar. Ayla's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Doi." Zayan's smile didn't falter. "You know you do." Silence stretched between them. It wasn't comfortable anymore. "I found something," Ayla said suddenly. The shift was instant. Zayan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "What do you mean?" "In your drawer," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "About a woman. An incident." A pause, long enough to matter. Then Zayan sighed, shaking his head slightly. You shouldn't go through my things, Ayla. That's what you're worried about? She asked, disbelief creeping in. Not what I found. There's nothing to find, he replied calmly. It's old, irrelevant. Then explain it. His gaze hardened, just for a second. I don't owe you an explanation for something that happened before you, he said. It doesn't just disappear, Ayla shot back. People don't just forget things like that. Zayan stepped closer, his voice lowering. You're making assumptions again. No, she said firmly. I'm seeing clearly for the first time. The words hung in the air. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Zayan laughed softly. Not warmly, not kindly. You think you've figured something out, he said, tilting his head slightly. That's interesting. Ayla's chest tightened. Why does it feel like I'm always the one apologizing? Because you're usually the one who's wrong. The answer came too quickly, too easily. Something inside her snapped. No, she said, shaking her head. That's what you want me to believe. Zayan's expression darkened. Be careful, Ayla. The tone was different now. Sharper, threatening. Or what? She challenged, her voice trembling but unyielding. For the first time, the calm mask slipped completely. You don't know what you're doing, he said quietly. Digging into things you don't understand. Then help me understand, she shouted. Her voice echoed through the house, louder than it had ever been before. Zayan stepped closer again, his presence suddenly overwhelming. You don't want the truth, he said. You couldn't handle it. Try me. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. A dangerous silence followed. Then, slowly, Zayan smiled. But this time, it wasn't reassuring. You think you're different, he said. Stronger than the others? Ayla froze. The others. Her heart pounded. What does that mean? She whispered. Zayan's eyes locked onto hers. It means you should stop before you turn into something you can't control. Fear crept up her spine, but beneath it, something else. Anger. Years of doubt, confusion, and quiet submission collided all at once. I'm not afraid of you, she said. It wasn't entirely true, but it was enough. Zayan's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, not violently, but firmly enough to make her flinch. You should be, he said. The room felt smaller. Irreversible. The word echoed through Ayla's mind long after the sound had faded. She didn't remember how long she stood there, staring, her breath shallow, her thoughts fractured into pieces she couldn't hold together. At some point, she moved. At some point, the house changed. By morning, the silence had been restored. When a knock came, it felt almost expected. Ayla opened the door slowly, her expression composed, her posture steady. Two officers stood outside, their presence formal but not yet suspicious. Ma'am, one of them said, we received a call about a possible missing person. Ayla nodded faintly. Yes, my husband, Zayan. He didn't come home last night. The lie came out smoothly. Too smoothly. Hours later, Detective Hamid arrived. He didn't rush. He observed everything. The house, the arrangement, the absence of disturbance. His eyes moved carefully, taking in details most would overlook. Mrs. Ayla, he said calmly, taking a seat across from her. Start from the beginning. Ayla folded her hands in her lap, her voice measured. He left in the evening. Said he had work. That's all. And when did you last speak to him? Around 8, maybe. She paused, as if trying to recall. He texted me. Said he'd be late. Hamid nodded slightly, jotting something down. Did he seem unusual lately? Ayla hesitated. Just enough. No, she said finally. Everything was normal. But Hamid's eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. Across the street, a neighbor spoke quietly to another officer, glancing toward the house. Heard something last night, the neighbor said. Loud voices. Around 10, maybe. Inside, Ayla sat perfectly still. Hamid returned his attention to her. Do you often argue? The question was casual, but it landed heavily. Every couple argues, Ayla replied softly. Of course, he said, but your neighbor mentioned raised voices. Ayla's fingers tightened slightly. It wasn't serious. Still, Hamid continued, details matter. Meanwhile, Sarah stood just outside the doorway, her arms crossed tightly as she watched everything unfold. She hadn't been invited, but she came anyway. Concern had turned into something else. Doubt. When Ayla finally stepped outside, Sarah approached her immediately. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice low but urgent. "He's missing," Ayla said, avoiding eye contact. Sarah searched her face. "Missing or gone?" The question lingered. Ayla frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't look worried," Sarah said bluntly. "You look controlled." "That's not fair," Ayla replied quickly. "I'm trying to stay calm." Sarah shook her head slightly. "You used to tell me everything." "I still do." "No," Sarah said firmly. "You don't." The tension between them grew, heavy and unresolved. Inside the house, Hamid moved slowly through each room, his attention caught by small inconsistencies. A glass, recently replaced. A faint mark on the floor, almost invisible but not entirely. A timeline that didn't sit quite right. He crouched slightly, running his fingers just above the surface without touching it, as if respecting something unseen. Then he stood, his expression unreadable. When he returned to Ayla, she was waiting. Still composed. Still careful. "Mrs. Ayla," he said, his voice calm but firmer now, "we'll need to ask a few more questions." "Of course," she replied. Hamid studied her for a long moment. Not her words, her pauses, her control. Then, quietly, he said, "You're not telling me everything." The silence that followed felt heavier than before. And this time, it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something was closing in. The investigation moved faster after that moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet precision. Detective Hamid didn't accuse. He didn't rush. He simply followed what didn't fit. And things weren't fitting. Zayan's records began to surface. Old files, archived complaints, fragments of a past that had never been fully erased. At first, they looked insignificant. Misunderstandings, disputes, nothing that led to charges. But when placed together, they formed something else. A pattern. There was another woman, Hamid said one afternoon, sitting across from Ayla again. His tone was calm, but deliberate. Years ago. Ayla's heart pounded, but her face remained still. "I don't know anything about that." "I think you do," he replied quietly. He placed a file on the table. Inside were statements. Incomplete, unresolved, but consistent enough to raise questions that had never been answered. "She claimed he manipulated her," Hamid continued. "Made her doubt herself. Controlled her environment." Ayla swallowed. The words felt familiar. Too familiar. "But she withdrew her complaint," he added. "Said it was all a misunderstanding." Ayla let out a slow breath. "So there's no proof." Hamid leaned back slightly. "Proof isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's behavioral." Silence filled the room. For the first time, Ayla didn't feel like she was being questioned. She felt seen, but it didn't last. Because the focus shifted. Back to her. "Tell me about that night again," Hamid said. Ayla hesitated. "Just for a second." "I already did." "Do it again." Something in his voice had changed. Not harsher, just clearer. Ayla looked down at her hands, her mind replaying fragments she could no longer control. The argument, the fear, the moment everything spiraled. But there was something else now. Something she hadn't said. Something she hadn't admitted, even to herself. "I told you," she began slowly. "We argued. He left. That's all." Hamid didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed something small on the table. A recorder. "We found this," he said. "In your bedroom." Ayla's breath caught. Her voice. She recognized it instantly, even before it played. The recording crackled softly before her own words filled the room. Unsteady. Whispered. Documenting. He said it again today, that I'm imagining things. That I forget. I'm writing everything down now, just in case. Ayla's chest tightened. The recording continued. "I don't feel safe anymore, but I don't know if that's real or if he's made me believe it." The audio stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before. "You were documenting him," Hamid said quietly. "Preparing." Ayla shook her head slightly. "I was scared." "I believe that," he replied. "But fear doesn't explain everything." Her eyes lifted to meet his. What does that mean? It means, Hamid said carefully, you didn't just react that night. The words landed slowly, deliberately. You were already expecting something. Ayla's thoughts blurred. Was she? Her mind searched for clarity but found only fragments. Notes, observations, the growing certainty that something was wrong. Had she been preparing to protect herself? Or something else? I didn't plan anything, she whispered. But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Because she remembered the notebook, the patterns, the realization. This wasn't the first time. And maybe she hadn't wanted it to be the last. Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. I just wanted it to stop, she said, her voice breaking. Hamid watched her carefully, not as a suspect, not as a victim, but as something in between. And somewhere in the quiet space between truth and intention, the line had already been crossed. And somewhere in the quiet space between truth and intention, the line had already been crossed. The final conversation didn't feel like an interrogation. It felt like an ending. Ayla sat across from Detective Hamid, her posture composed, her face calm in a way that no longer seemed natural. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the recorder placed between them. You can still tell the full truth, Hamid said gently. Ayla looked at it, then back at him. I have. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Hamid studied her for a long moment. You've documented everything. You saw the pattern. You knew what he was capable of. Ayla's fingers intertwined slowly. I knew what he made me feel. And that night, her breath caught just slightly. We argued, she said. He lost control. And you? Hamid asked. A pause. I reacted. The word hung there, fragile, incomplete. Hamid didn't push further. Maybe he understood that some truths don't come out in full sentences. They exist in fragments, buried between what is said and what is avoided. There's no body, he said quietly. No clear evidence of what happened after. Ayla didn't respond, because that was the part she would never explain. The silence stretched, heavy but final. Legally, the case would remain unresolved. A missing person, circumstantial doubt, no definitive conclusion. But morally, that was something else entirely. As Ayla stood to leave, her expression didn't change. There was no visible relief. No visible guilt. Just stillness. At the door, she paused. For what it's worth, she said softly, without turning around, you were right. Hamid didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. She hadn't told him everything. After she left, the room felt colder. Hamid leaned back in his chair, his eyes lingering on the empty space where she had been sitting. Cases like this didn't end cleanly. They didn't offer closure. Only questions. He thought about Zayan, the charm, the control, the hidden past. He thought about Ayla, the fear, the silence, the quiet preparation. And somewhere between them, something had broken beyond repair. Not just a marriage. Something deeper. Irreversible. Hamid exhaled slowly, turning off the recorder. Because sometimes the most terrifying truth isn't what happened. It's what people are capable of when no one is watching.